Welcome to our MATLAB tutorial series. Today we're going to talk about using looping structures to navigate a matrix. So here's a short code I've written where we have a sample matrix, which is a 3x3 matrix of terms, and then we have a command called size where we get the number of rows and number of columns, and then we have our index for a vector that we're going to make later that we initialize at 1. Then we have a nested looping structure. So we have two for loops. So the first for loop has an index called row. It starts at 1 and goes to the maximum number of rows in our matrix. Then we have another one. This is a nested one. So that's a looping structure that is within another looping structure. So it's a nested looping structure. It goes by column, or it's called column, and it starts at 1 and goes to the number of columns in this sample matrix. Then we have a matrix to vector. So what we're doing is taking this matrix and then putting it all into a vector. So we're going to take the two-dimensional matrix and make it just one long vector. And then we're going to increment our index and be done with that loop of that looping structure. So to start off, we have our sample matrix, as you can see over here. So when we go through this nested looping structure, we're going to have rows, we're going to have columns, and then we're going to have, what term are we indexing? So you put the name of the matrix that you're indexing into, and so since it's a two-dimensional matrix, we're going rows, comma, columns. And I've called it row, comma, column, but remember that MATLAB, if you have a two-dimensional matrix, it's always row, comma, column, no matter what you call it. So this is what we're going to start off with. So if we get to the outside of this loop, we start with the first for loop. So row is going to start at 1. After row has been initialized at 1, column is initialized at 1. And so then we have sample matrix 1, comma 1. So what is the first term in the sample matrix? The one is in the first row in the first column. It's the number 1. So if we were making this matrix to vector, so if we're actually making this, it would be, the first term would be 1. So the next, we're still in this inside for loop. So we've gone through it once, and now we increment column to 2. So we haven't finished the inside for loop yet, so we haven't gone back to the outside for loop. So row is still 1, but column has incremented to 2. So what is the term in the first row in the second column of the matrix? That's 5. So our code would add that to the vector. Now we go back around, we've gone column 2, so we increment column to 3. Row is still 1 because we haven't finished the inner for loop yet. So what's the term in the first row in the third column of the matrix? That's a 5. And so now we've come around, column goes to 4, which is greater than the number of columns in the matrix. So this inner for loop is done. So we get out, go back out. Now we get back to the outer for loop, which we have just finished the first iteration of. So now row increments to 2. So now that we've incremented row to 2, we go back to the inner for loop where we start over now because we've just started with a new increment for row. So column is back to 1. So what's the term in the second row, first column of the matrix? That is a 2. So we're back in the inner matrix. We increment the column to 2 again because now we just had 1. Row is still 2 because we're still in the inside for loop. So what's the term in the second row, second column of the matrix? That is a 4. And so you keep going. You increment the inner 1, so row stays the same, column goes to 3, this term is a 6. I forget to keep updating this. So now that we've reached the end of the second row, we've gone all 3 columns, the outer loop increments to the third row now, back to the first term, the third row first term is 10, back over here, still in the third row, the second term is 11, third row, third column, so what's the third row, third column term? That is 12. And so if I had been remembering to update this, so this is what our vector would be. So this is an example of using nested loops to increment through a two-dimensional matrix. So the first loop that we have is row, and that increments through the rows, but it only increments to the next one once all the code inside it has been executed. And so it only increments once the for loop inside for column has gone through each one of the columns for each row. So while we're in the first row, you increment through all 3 columns. While you're in the second row, you increment through all 3 columns.